welcome everyone to this session on ethnic studies in K-12 schools. And we are going to discuss the proposed model curriculum and learn about whether we think it's balanced or politicized. And you are welcome to form your own opinion. And I'm Liang Fan Chao. I'm currently on the Cupertino City Council, and I'm also a co-founder of Young American Policy Advocates, which is a group that we are connecting high schoolers with mentors to study issues such as this. And I am representing only myself today. It is not any represent the City Council. And I just learned about this issue last week. So I'm also learning in the process of learning like everyone. And I believe this is an important issue because this will become a curriculum taught in K-12 schools. It doesn't matter whether you're political leaning. This will be in the schools and it will be taught to the next generation. So we had better find out what's in there and whether it will be taught in the best way possible to educate our next generation. Next slide, please. So this summarizes what we are looking at. California is looking in the process of adopting a bill that will make ethnic studies one of the high school graduation requirement. This will be the first of the entire nation. And some other individual schools already made the ethnic studies a graduation requirement. But for California, we will be the first state to make it a requirement for every high school. And other states will likely follow. And of course, I mean, we would like to see ethnic studies in our schools so that our students can learn to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions from multiple cultures. This is the legislative intent of California legislators when they proposed to create a model curriculum. However, the draft curriculum has drawn criticisms from various groups, and people are concerned that it's emphasizing oppression and blaming capitalism, which forms the foundation of America today, and white privilege. So I think some of us then are concerned about whether this is the best way to frame this, educate our next generation. And here we would show you how, if you like, or even if you don't like, whatever is the opinion on the curriculum, how you can influence the curriculum adoption process in the state and the county and your school district. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we are lucky today that we have a few people joining us. So let's go to gallery view. We have Elena Kaplan. She is a co-founder of Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, and they are a group of a lot of community volunteers who are concerned and has spent a lot of time to study the model curriculum. Hi, Elena, welcome. And we are also lucky that I found William Roche. He has been teaching ethnic studies in Los Angeles. He's a social science teacher, and he will share the concerns and the plus and minus of the implementation side of ethnic studies at the ground. Hi, Will, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited for Sode Kasansetti to be here. Suda is a good friend, and she is a avid community volunteer and a mom who has been involved with children's education a lot, and she is running for school board in Cupertino Union School Board. and she's like me, learning about this. So we are all open-eyed and want to find out what's in stock for us. So Elena will, oh, I think next slide, we will have the schedule. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we will first hear from Elena about the model curriculum that's proposed and the process. And then we will hear from Will about the implementation in high school. And then we will have this panel discussion where I and maybe Soda can also ask questions about the curriculum. And then we will tell you what you might do if you want to get involved in forming what will be taught to our kids. And then we will have a live Q&A. And you are welcome to put in your questions in the Q&A box on the webinar. And there is another chat window. But if you have questions, put it in the Q&A and so that we can then come to it at the end. Okay, next slide, please. So Elena, take it away.
Get started. Honored to be here. I'm very excited to share this information with you and hear people's questions. I too am learning, although it's been about a year-long process for me. So there are many complexities here, and definitely like an onion. Every time you think that okay, you got it, there's another layer to this. So let's hope that let's try to unpeel a whole bunch of layers here. Let's go to the first slide. So what is ethnic studies? It turns out that the field is really undefined. And I think this is where this is where the complexity starts, because it's just not clear what ethnic study is. There's no one opinion on this is it. So next slide, and we'll see, go to the next slide, that you could break it down into two buckets, and there's a bunch in between, but let's look at two buckets. One that I have started calling regular ethnic studies, for lack of a better term. And this is the model of ethnic studies that emphasizes building bridges, it emphasizes ethnic group contribution, it emphasizes critical thinking, putting out information, and having students, just like we always do in education, have them use a critical thinking skill to draw their own conclusions. But the emphasis is really on empathy and understanding. There's another model that's called the critical ethnic studies model, and that one has a very particular paradigm. It's a victim-oppressor paradigm. It has a very particular ideology and a movement, as they express it, to challenge imperialistic colonial hegemonic beliefs and practices. So you can see in the flavors that these are very different types of ethnic studies, and they almost sound like completely different animals, and we'll see how that plays out. Next slide, please. So here's the legislative intent of the person that authored this bill. And you can look at what the intent was of that bill. It was to empower all students to learn about each other. It was to learn about history and contributions, and it was to develop a better understanding of California's diverse history. So these are all things that the legislators were looking to do when they said, please go ahead and get going on creating an ethnic studies model curriculum. That's what the bill authorized. Take a pause for a moment to look at what it was trying to accomplish. Now let's go to the next slide. And then we came out with the ethnic studies model curriculum, whose goal is to critique empire and its relationship to white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power and oppression at the intersections of our society. And then you can see some of the rest. Now, let's flip back for a moment to the slide before this. Let's go earlier. Let's go to the one before. or not, we'll just, okay, that might be a little hard. I just wanted folks to see the contrast between what these principles are and what the legislative intent was. And we can see where the legislative intent is. What did the legislators mean? They meant this building bridges, this understanding. And as it came out, the model curriculum came from a critical ethnic studies perspective. And this we see in the guiding principles. And you can see that the themes are all around colonialism, hegemony, systems of power. These are all quotes, by the way. These come directly from the ethnic studies model curriculum that I'll abbreviate, by the way. I'll refer to it as either curriculum or the ESMC as an abbreviation. Okay, next slide, please. So what is the ideology that is behind this? Because there is a political ideology here. And the particular one that we're talking about that has to do with the ESMC is a Neo-Marxist Third World Liberation Front ideology. Capitalism is placed together as a form of power and oppression, along with racism and white supremacy. Now, the issue, of course, is that just like the Black Panther movement, which is very closely related to the Third World Liberation Front, there are definitely things to be learned about it, and nobody would ever claim that these things should not be learned. The difference is between topics being taught versus promoted as the framework around which we want students to set their ideology. So this particular ideology has to do with, for example, admiring communist countries like Cuba, like North Korea. It plays down the nonviolent role models such as Martin Luther King as being too passive. It's clearly a very particular point of view. Again, nothing wrong with teaching it, and there are a lot of important things that come out from these movements that are worth learning. The issue is whether or not it is promoted as the ideology. And you can see from the history of social science framework, which is what teachers in California are supposed to use to guide them, that a balance is expected and teachers are expected to provide different points of view and perspectives. Next slide, please. There have been a lot of thoughts about the curriculum. And the first draft, when it came out, had a huge pushback from all across the board. And this is really one of the things that I like to emphasize to folks is this is not a left side, right side issue, left wing, right wing. This is really about it. And I would be saying the exact same thing if the ideology being promoted were a right wing ideology. It really has to do with whether or not there should be any political ideology in the classroom. So the LA Times in particular talked about the idea that these are more predigested political views rather than widening the students' perspectives, but there were loads and loads of op-eds, editorials, public comments that came in saying you need to change this. Unfortunately, with the second draft that came out, and we'll talk about the differences between the first and second draft, with the second draft that came out, doesn't seem like we're far off. And so from a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal entire editorial board, just like the LA Times entire editorial board, evaluated looked at the curriculum, looked at the update, looking to see what changes have been made, and still said that no, same thing, we're still force feeding particular theories. Cal Matters, which is a nonprofit on California that reports on California policies and public policy, reported that nope, still the same ideological indoctrination is still there. Next slide, please. So how did that play out? Because it's, so we got the theory, but how do we actually experience it in the actual curriculum? And the hard thing is the curriculum, the first draft was about 600 pages long. The second one is over 400 pages long. As you can imagine, very few people actually sit down and read the whole thing. What they get caught up in instead is, oh, ethnic studies, that sounds good. And don't go further to actually see what does it mean. So how does the ideology translate? One way we see that is whenever there's a choice of role models or figures of significance as they're called in the curriculum, there's a consistent choice of Marxist militant role models. So for example, we omit leaders like John Lewis or Martin Luther King or Thurgood Marshall. They are described as passive or docile. And these are nonviolent leaders working within the system, but instead we've got role models like 3 different Black Panthers. We've got, for example, on the Japanese reparations section, we don't have Norm Mineta or Robert Matsui, but we do have Yuri Fujiyama, a Maoist who admired Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And the list goes on and on. And in the first draft, we see this list completely fleshed out. What happened with the second draft is because the specifics were removed in order to deal with the backlash that they got, you can't see a lot of these specifics, but the principles and the framework is still the same. So what you have to do is look at the first draft to understand what are the details that come out of this framework. You can just see a quote from an African-American educator who talks about her startling revelation about this and saying, how can we tell our story? And we're hearing the same thing from different ethnic groups saying the same thing over and over again, that their story is incomplete. Next slide, please. So the question is, how did this happen? Because I just described you a path that starts with a very reasonable sounding. I mean, some people might disagree that we needed ethnic studies as opposed to incorporating it into existing courses. But fundamentally, when you look at what the bill is trying to accomplish, I think few people would argue with the idea that building understanding is a bad thing. So the question is, how in the world did we get from that to where we are today? Next slide. Okay, so a couple of comments on the sequence of the bills. AB 2016 is the one that created this model curriculum. There's a separate bill that you may have heard about. It's AB 331, and that one requires ethnic studies to be a mandatory course for high school graduation. The course is based on the ESMC, so that's where we have the connection, right? There's 331 that's making it mandatory to take ethnic studies in order to graduate, and it depends on the ESMC that is produced by AB 2016. And that's why it's important to look at the ESMC, because this is telling us what it is that students are going to be required to do. Also note that although the requirement is for high school students, the intent for the ESMC, the stated intent, is actually to go K through 12. 331 has been passed by the California Senate and Assembly and is currently awaiting the governor's approval. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what happened? The ESMC was guided by an advisory committee, and it just so happened that the advisory committee consisted mostly of critical ethnic studies scholar activists. Remember, there's 2 types of ethnic studies that I described in that one bucket that's critical ethnic studies. It's the people that came from that bucket that comprise most of the committee. You can ask the question of, well, why did that happen? And gets into the technical details of who was nominating, and it just so happens that one person that was doing most of the nominating, one person that came from the Instructional Quality Commission, who is a critical ethnic studies leader, ended up nominating more than half of the individuals for the advisory committee. And as a result, the majority of them ended up being critical ethnic studies people. After the swell of criticism for the various forms of hatred that was coming out from this and ideological indoctrination, the draft went back to the CDE, the California Department of Education, and they said, we're going to try again. And draft 2 was recently completed. The original advisory committee was dismissed, and you'll hear that, hey, we started from scratch, and they dismissed. However, many of them were recycled back as experts, as people that were consulted on the second draft. So that's why, if you're wondering, well, then why didn't we just start from scratch completely? It's because many of the people that were presumably dismissed ended up back involved as experts on this next draft. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this thing look like? I just wanted you to have a sense of what is the document. So it focuses on 4 core groups, and this comes from the idea that critical ethnic studies as a discipline, as it's taught in college, has defined for itself that it focuses on 4 core groups: African American, Latinx, Asian American, they've added Pacific Islander, and Native American. So in the Asian American section, if you look in the set of lessons, these are the lessons you'll see, and you can kind of get a feel for what they're like. So the Hmong Americans focus on community struggle and voice. We've got the United Farm Workers Movement, Chinese railroad workers. So these are the 5 that I listed here are the ones that are spelled out in the section for lessons, and then there's a list of various topics that are suggested. The entire document is still over 400 pages long, and it's got these different pieces that have the bibliography and the approved classes and all sorts of things, but the bulk of it is basically the sections of the lessons. Okay, next slide, please. So what happened with draft 2 is most of this, the approach that they took is to remove most of the specifics that were in draft 1. So those role models that I listed, where it went into lots and lots of specifics, and it kind of makes you raise your eyebrows and go, that seems to be very unbalanced. Why is there so much emphasis on the Marxist militant types? Why are the other ones completely not just minimized, but totally overlooked? They took out the specifics. But what was left is the guiding principles and the approach and the topics themselves. So this is what I was saying, that why, if you want to understand, and it's not obvious unless, and those people that came from communist countries, for example, tend to get it much faster. And when they see it, they kind of go, I know exactly where this is going. For those of us that weren't, it's helpful to look at what were the specifics that came out from these principles. In addition, there's a bunch of stuff that remains in the links and the footnotes. It's under the radar, but it's not that under the radar. So all you really have to do is click on the various links, and you have to look at the footnotes, and you can get the overall approach. So for example, one of the textbooks used is Education at War, that talks about how informed by ethnic studies would bring into conversation the ways that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus. They also describe schools as battlefields where war is waged. Now, this is definitely one perspective, but the question that you have to ask is, does that match what was intended? Again, keep thinking back to what was the intent of ethnic studies and what was the intent of having this model curriculum. Next slide, please. So among these guiding principles, and for anybody that's interested, I can forward them to you and we'll see them in a moment. You'll see 4 of them in a moment. 4 of them promote the specific political ideology that I was talking about, and the lessons all follow from these principles. Next slide, please. So just to get a sense of a comparison, you can look at one that's a current guiding principle, right? Connect ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movements that struggle for social justice on the global and local levels to ensure a truer democracy. It doesn't quite make your jaw drop unless you are, for example, a former Soviet emigre who looks in this and goes, what? This is what I learned in my school when I was growing up. Because truer democracy is a Marxist dog whistle and is a term for the abolition of private property and a term for communism. If it were just alone, you could think, oh, that's just a coincidence. You might ask, well, why didn't they use a different term for it, like a more perfect union, which is something that we use in language in America. And when asked to change it, the answer was no. They wanted to stick with this. It was very important for the advocates and for the people that came up with these principles to stick with this one. And again, it's in context with everything else, right? So if somebody says, oh, come on, just true democracy, that's a good thing. You just going off into La La Land. The key is to look at this in context with everything else. Now let's compare this. So I underlined the parts of it that don't jump out until you kind of look a little closer, right? The resistance movements, the struggle for democracy. Let's compare this to a different ethnic studies principle. This one is from the LA district, the LAUSD, the largest district in California. And it too has an ethnic studies course. And its principle says that they want to teach students about social justice, social responsibility, and to understand how they can become agents of change, not part of resistance movements necessarily, they might, right? But the key is for them to become agents of change at different levels in some way, whether it's within the system or outside of the system. So we can see a contrast. And the thing that's interesting is that critical ethnic studies is not the only way. We saw at the very beginning that there are these different buckets. What we know is that it's not the only way to teach ethnic studies because it's happened. So the LAUSD, for example, chooses the approach that's shown by this principle, the approach of teaching the regular ethnic studies. Next slide, please. In draft 2, what happened was that the California Department of Education gave it a try and said, okay, we see that there's a problem. And they came up with these outcomes. And the outcomes really look quite reasonable. If you look at this, there's building bridges of intergroup understanding, there's promoting honesty and nuance. They're really quite good. Civic participation skills, encouraging assessment of various strategies. This is the stuff we want for our kids, right? Would make sense in lots of different contexts, particularly in ethnic studies. They tied those outcomes to the lessons. Unfortunately, at the Instructional Quality Commission meeting, the outcomes were decoupled from the lessons, and instead what was asked is to take the guiding principles, an example of which we just saw, and tie those to the lessons. Now, any educators among you will know that, well, lessons are tied to outcomes. When teachers figure out what to teach, they look at the outcomes, they figure out what is it they're trying to accomplish, and they tie the lessons to the outcomes, right? However, because of the politics of this, the outcomes kind of got weakened and minimized, and the guiding principles were asked by this Instructional Quality Commission to come back in a stronger way and repeated multiple times, and they were asked to tie the lessons to the guiding principles. Now let's go to the next slide to see what guiding principles are. Of the guiding principles, 1 through 3 sound quite neutral. 4 through 7 is what you see in front of you. And these are the 4 that I was referring to when I said that there's a particular political ideology. And if you want to know more about this, there are a couple of ways to do this. One is to, I recommend personally, because it's been helpful for me, to ask folks that have grown up in communist systems to help you interpret what this is. And 2 is to do a bit of research online and to understand what critical ethnic studies is. So what you would do is go to Critical Ethnic Studies Association and read more of the context and understand where the ideology is coming from. Again, keep in mind that the argument is not to not teach this, because it's important for kids to be exposed to all sorts of perspectives. It's more that these are the guiding principles and are tied to each of the lessons in the curriculum. Okay, next slide. So since August 2019, so as you recall, the first draft came out in 2019, the original members of that advisory committee that got dismissed formed a Save Ethnic Studies group, whose emphasis is to keep the draft as is meaning the first draft. So there's a really big advocacy effort going on, California and also across the country really, in order to keep the draft as it was in the first draft as close to it as possible. So not only to keep those guiding principles, but to even revert back and use the specifics that came out of them. It goes under the title of Save Ethnic Studies, but the truth is that this isn't about saving ethnic studies. The argument is around saving this form of ethnic studies and around this type of a curriculum. It's not the other side that they're having an argument with is not saying dump ethnic studies. It's saying different ethnic studies, the LAUSD type ethnic studies. Next slide. So what can we do? What does it mean to get some balance in this? So one thing we can do is to revise the guiding principle and simply remove the political agenda. We could remove the guiding principles altogether because the outcomes are very clear and can serve as guiding principles absolutely. We can keep 1 through 3 of the guiding principles and change the 4 through 7 or remove 4 through 7 altogether. There are any number of things, but because the model curriculum is only a model and it's giving an approach and a model for how to do this, it's super important that we get these guiding principles right, because that is the thing that teachers have to go by. That is what they're going to be using as guidance to understand what to teach. The other thing we can do is add something called elements of balance that the LAUSD Ethnic Studies framework uses. And I just put up a few examples of what is in this elements of balance document that they use. They kind of, I think of them as safeguards in case there's a tendency or a temptation to load into advocacy and into promoting a political ideology. These are things that actually say, well, no, you're supposed to present a balanced point of view. It explicitly, in the last bullet, you see that it explicitly says that you are not supposed to do advocacy or get across personal opinion, bias, or partisanship. So is it perfect? No. And you can be sure that, of course, bias comes into the classroom. And of course, there's going to be, in different classes for individual teachers who have a lot of leeway, there's going to be some of this that sneaks in. However, at least this is a safeguard and an attempt to minimize the political ideology from coming into the classroom. Next. I just wanted to share, there are lots and lots of comments, and I just wanted to share with you something that came out in one of the public comments that jumped out at me and really spoke to me. And a community leader that we work with talked about the idea that something slightly different from the political ideology, that not only is it a problem to have a specific political ideology, but many, like this person, are saying, I don't want a politicized curriculum at all. What is a politicized curriculum doing in an ethnic studies course where we're supposed to be learning about each other and learning about contributions and learning to build understanding and empathy and da-da-da? Where are the authors, business executives, scientists, doctors? Where's our heritage? Where are our contributions? And I didn't want to lose that point, because there's definitely, just to give you a general sense, there's definitely a line of thinking that goes, okay, political ideology, bad, but the whole thing shouldn't be politicized in the first place. Next slide. Why is this big? Well, first of all, as we talked about, it's going to be a high school graduation requirement shortly. K through 8 are already beginning. Not only is the ESMC intended for K through 8, but they're already beginning to implement it. And there are national plans for ethnic studies. So for those of you that are wondering, well, why in the world is the national media paying attention to this? What's the Wall Street Journal editorial board doing, commenting on it? It's because many states have already announced plans to incorporate the California curriculum. They're waiting to have that approved so that they can incorporate it in their own states. And the National Education Association, 3 million strong, has already announced that as soon as the California ESMC is adopted, that is what they will be adopting. Next slide. So what's next? Currently, we're in the public comment period, and we have between now and September 30th to officially submit comments. You may continue to do so throughout the month of October. They always take comments, but now is specifically the time that they have designated to be processing a lot of these. November 18th, the Instructional Quality Commission will take a vote on whatever the next draft is going to be. And then there's going to be another period, 45 days, public comment period for minor revisions. So one thing I want to caution you is the reason this period is important is that right now is when we're talking about the conceptual issues. So when somebody says, oh, don't worry, there's going to be another public comment period, that's true, but by then we're going to be talking about much more minor revisions. Okay, January, March, the State Board of Education will take a vote. Let's go to the next slide, and that'll be the vote on whether or not to approve the entire draft. And next slide. Okay, so what happens now? You can sign various action alerts. Numbers matter a lot. That is how we ended up with draft 2 instead of draft 1. Now, one could argue that didn't get us very far, but it certainly got us somewhere because the people that made their voices heard ensured that the California Department of Education went back to the drawing board and did some serious work, and there was progress on the draft. It is completely dependent on the amount of voices, the number of voices that they hear. So you can look at the action alert. You also get an email with this action alert so that you can click on it. Please do forward it to everyone, talk to your friends, write letters to the editor, become engaged in this. It matters to absolutely everybody, whether they have kids or not, whether they are a teacher or not. You can also contact local school boards. So right now, there are many schools, many districts that are talking about adopting either this particular curriculum or some form of ethnic studies. So educate them about the regular versus critical ethnic studies. Educate them that there is a different way to do this, and there are schools that have done this successfully. Organize with others, ask others to write to their school board, organize together with them to have a meeting with school board members or submit petitions. We are always there to help. You can email CalS Studies. And you can ask questions or can provide resources for you. I think let's go to the next slide, or are we gonna pause there? Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there and turn it over to Will. And then I think at the end, we'll have some Q&A.
Okay, great. Well, so
Okay.
I accidentally found out about WELL because I was starting to watch a lot of videos about how college campus has become more and more one-sided, and they couldn't tolerate a diverse opinion. There are professors being demoted or even removed from position because of one minor comment that they've made and someone complained. So Professor Jonathan Haidt has some YouTube videos that's raising this issue, and he founded a Heterodox Academy that's trying to promote diverse, respect for but diverse point of views. And Will Roche is the lead, I think, for California. And then that's how I found out about him. And then it happens to be that ethnic studies is something that's even related. That was even before I learned about ethnic studies. So welcome, Will.
Cool, thank you. Alina, that was great. That was really good. I'm gonna try not to be repetitive because there's certain things where it might overlap, and I'll try not to do that. Thank you for everyone who's watching this. Happy to answer questions. At the end, I'll give my contact. This is something I think is really important. I'm biased, but I think that that the best education we can possibly give to our next generation is really important. So next. So just a little bit of background is I've been teaching for 15 years. I taught 2 years in Pennsylvania, and then I've been out in California for, it was like a year and a half in Pennsylvania, and then I've been out in California for about 13 and a half, 14 years. All areas of social sciences, grades 8 through 12, and in various communities. I've taught literally like kids who are on like TV shows, like household name actors, and gang members who got arrested for murder. I've taught like kids whose parents run hedge funds and are literally like billionaires, and kids who sleep in a car or sleep under an overpass or something like that. So I have a lot of diverse experiences. One of the things about ethnic studies is it should be beautiful. It should be something about unity and something beautiful. And having taught in all of these communities, I've been to quinceañeras and barbecues where I was the only white guy there, and bar mitzvahs and all these kinds of things, and you get to take in all of these cultures that I wasn't aware of, and it's really incredible, and you really get a sense of America, and what makes America awesome is the diversity that we have, and how to celebrate that, I think, is something really incredible and important. As was mentioned, I am the co-moderator of the Heterodox Academy K through 12 education group, which is on Facebook, but also Heterodox Academy, I pushed them pretty hard to open up to K through 12 educators, and now they're accepting K through 12 educators to be able to discuss viewpoint diversity in a, lack of a better term, a safe space. So so that we can, challenge different ideas and talk about things and really try and find out what's the best way to move forward with all kinds of controversial ideas and things like that. I'm also a member of Civic Spirit, which is an organization that promotes civic education and things like that. And I have a podcast called Cylinder Radio, again, about viewpoint diversity. The idea, I don't have a cylinder here, but the idea is if you look at a cylinder from one side, it looks just like a circle. If you look at it from the other side, it looks like a rectangle, but it's actually a three-dimensional shape. So there's a lot of nuance and complexity that you don't see only from your vantage point. I've had on 3 of the last 4 National Teachers of the Year. I've had on Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, a whole bunch of different people that are well respected in social science and things like that. Next. Okay, so what's in a name? And I think initially we have to address this concept of how could you possibly be against the idea of social justice or ethnic studies or something like anti-racism, cultural studies, anything like that. The name can be very deceiving. And I think Alina went into this like really well. I've heard it be called a Trojan horse term, where you bring it in because it seems like what could possibly be wrong with this? And that's how some bad ideas could work their way in, because it wouldn't even occur to you that something as beautiful sounding as anti-racism could ever be a negative. So next. But part of the issue is that it is not proven to improve marginalized communities. And proof is something that we have to go on in social sciences. It's possible that there's even perverse unintended consequences that'll emerge from this. I don't know the degree of how much of this is intentional and how much of it is unintended, but similar to affirmative action, the data is not clear that affirmative action is beneficial to the communities that it was designed to help. This is a book called Mismatch, and it lays out a pretty good argument that affirmative action is actually not doing the job that it was intended to do, even if the intentions were good. So next. Okay, this is political, as was mentioned, and it's supposed to be political. Some of this emerges from Howard Zinn. I use Howard Zinn. I use the People's History of the United States in my class. But I use it along with other things. If you look up the Wikipedia entry for cultural studies, it says political project over and over and over again, established by activists and English majors. It says this is a political project, a political project, a political project, assisted by Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Judith Butler. This is clearly a political project, and it's nakedly so. So it's important that we recognize that this is about teaching politics, particular politics in the classroom. And then we can have the discussion of whether or not that's good, but we need to just, kind of like call it for what it is and what it's intended to be. Next. This is the older version. I changed this up a little bit, but that's fine. It's not just a left-wing political movement. It's a very specific kind of movement. Go to the next slide. Should have had, this works. It's a specific narrative that's not even from the left, because the left, liberal principles of John Stuart Mill and things like that are about civil discourse and making sure that all viewpoints are represented and things of that nature. Next, please. If you can just click on a couple so I get to the end of this slide. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean by its very specific narrative. Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates are 2 examples of people who are modern and promoted as being people we should promote. So I know a lot of educators that are reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, the Robin DiAngelo book of White Fragility, Peggy McIntosh, her idea of white privilege and things like that. Those are all acceptable, but Thomas Sowell or John McWhorter, who are highly respected, Black men who have achieved a lot in the academic world, their narrative is not brought in. Next, please. People like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Oh, can you go back one, please? Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Black woman, a Muslim Black woman, immigrant. Chloe Valdery, a Black woman from Louisiana. Someone like Aisha Akanbi. Their perspective is not taken into account because they don't have necessarily the same political viewpoints, even though they fit the intersectionality matrix of being immigrant, Muslim, Black woman. If their narrative and their viewpoints don't align with this ideology, then they're not included. And that is where I think the problem lies, is we don't have diversity within our diversity. And therefore, it's clearly not about elevating Black voices, let's say. It's about elevating a very specific faction of Black voices, let's say, for this example. Next, please. So the lack of rigorous social science. The scientific method is important. And one of the things that I really love about the scientific method is the concept of seeking disconfirmation, not confirmation bias, is when you have a hypothesis. So it could be anything. It could be Donald Trump is wonderful or Donald Trump is terrible. It doesn't really matter what it is try to prove yourself wrong. Because if you believe that gravity exists, try to prove it wrong, and you're gonna have a tough time. So trying to prove something wrong in your journey, as opposed to trying to find how you're right, will get you closer to the truth. And it's challenging and it's disruptive to your, your mindset that is so happy to feel like you're right. But Einstein said here, if we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research. So we need to have some intellectual humility and some genuine curiosity. Next, please. The people on the right here. One more, please. I covered that. Oh, here we go. The Grievance Studies Affair, the hoax paper. So the people on the right, that's James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose in the middle, and Peter Boghossian on the right. If you're not familiar with what they did, they were three prominent academics who felt like there wasn't rigorous social science going into what they called the grievance studies, which is critical theories, critical social justice theories, gender studies, race studies, fat studies, queer studies, things like that. So they made up stories and they wrote an entire life's worth of work in a few months. And these papers got peer reviewed and published in the top academic journals. And they even won awards for excellent scholarship. And then they had to say, no, we made this all up. And there were some disturbing ones. Some of them, it was funny. Some of them, like, they made up a story about how dog parks promote rape culture. And they said how they inspected 10,000 different dogs' genitals, which would take like 3 years to do. And then asked the owners how the dog identifies. And it won an award for excellent scholarship in one of the top gender studies journals. They took Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's book, and they changed the language to everywhere it said Nazis, it was changed to women of color, and everywhere it said Jews, it was changed to straight white men, and that was accepted in an academic journal. So it was quite startling what they revealed about these social science classes, if you want to use air quotes, and the lack of rigor, that it was very much just pushing forth this agenda, no matter what, as long as it followed that agenda. Next, please. There we go. Now, part of the reason why we're in this is because we see things so differently. Some people probably, even some of you are like, this feels very wrong. This feels very weird to me. How can we be talking about this stuff? It just doesn't sit right with you. So Jonathan Haidt, who started the Heterodox Academy, did excellent research on why is it that we see morality so differently. And the way he explains is kind of like taste buds. Like for some of you, you eat cilantro and it tastes great. Some of you eat cilantro and it tastes like soap. And we don't have the same taste buds. You go to a restaurant, you're like, what tastes great here? It's a silly question sometimes because we all have different taste buds. And morality actually works the same way, that we don't view all things the same when it comes to morality, and there's different taste buds, and some of them are stronger than the others. Some of us like sweet things, and some of us like salty things and savory things and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's how we are through our morals as well. So that's part of the reason why we don't always see eye to eye on issues like this. And we see some people see something as horribly immoral and other people don't see it as immoral at all. It's not that one is immoral, we're differently moral. It's not like cilantro objectively tastes bad. It subjectively tastes bad. And that's important to recognize. Next, please. So these are what the taste buds are. And some people, if you're more left-brained or right-brained, more conservative, more liberal, some of these are going to be heightened more than others. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how this works. Click, click. Hope you guys are doing well. So you can see here from very conservative to very liberal. Oh, go back one, please. Almost done, almost done. Hopefully you guys aren't falling asleep. I do this all day long, and I look at the faces of 11th graders and stuff while I'm teaching, and it's just like, so it's hard to get like the feedback. I miss teaching in the classroom. But you can see here that harm and fairness is very high, okay, for liberal people, and it's lower for. I'm sorry, harm and fairness is very high for the very liberal, and it's a little bit lower for the very conservative. And things like respect for authority. Respect for authority is higher among more conservatives. Purity is higher for more conservatives. So what happens is certain people say, oh, that's wrong, and other people are like, there's nothing wrong with that. And we need to understand why it is that we see morality so differently. And I think that's a big part of why we're in this debate. And the more that we can understand why people are seeing things so differently than ourselves, then we can have an actual conversation about how to best approach these ethnic studies and do it the best way that we can. And I would say like the general ethnic studies, the way that Alina said, I think she's spot on with, we can make this into something beautiful if it'll be allowed. So next thing. So there's a need for critical thinking and viewpoint diversity. Heterodox Academy membership is open for K-12 educators, and you are welcome. You are welcome, please. Please join us, have the conversation. We love disagreement. I love disagreement. I love being proven wrong. I think we can do this with grace for one another and really focus on what this is about, is giving our kids, the next generation, the best education that they can so that they can go on and fix some societal problems. And I think we can all agree that we have problems to fix. So let's go about doing this the best way that we possibly can. Also on Facebook, please check out K-12 Education, Heterodox K-12 Education Group on Facebook. And this is their motto here is great minds don't always think alike. And that's important to get this done right, is we need all perspectives. So if you disagree with something that I said, I would love to talk to you about it, and we can have a kind, respectful conversation. I think that's it. Is that it? Oh, yeah. Oh, you can contact me anytime. cylinderradio@gmail.com. My name is also a website that I just started. And I use Instagram a lot. That's the one that the youngins are on. So I use that for teachers and posting things, news commentary and stuff like that. And Heterodox Academy.
Thank you so much. At first, I was depressed that, oh my God, these are being taught. And now I'm like hopeful we could make this something beautiful, that we can all help to create something beautiful for our children in the education that really teach them how to approach, how to even have a dialogue with people who we disagree. That's a very important skill to have. So we will have some discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Suda. Suda is like me. We are both just learning about this topic. and this past week. So Suda, why don't you first introduce yourself and then share from a parent's point of view, what do you think about what you have learned today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liang. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today on such an important, talking about such an important topic, which is going to affect every one of us. So my name is Sudha Kasim Sedi, and I'm a mom of 2 kids, and I'm running for a Cupertino School Board this November. And Elena and Will, thank you for the wonderful presentation. And on the contrary, Will, we actually did not sleep. We actually woke up, and I think that's very, very important. As a parent, after listening to both of you, I feel that it's so important to be aware of how it can affect your kid. If you don't have a balanced curriculum, we are so fortunate to be in a state like California, which is so enriched with so many kids of different cultures and ethnicities. We should embrace them, yes. But as a parent, to me, a balanced curriculum means bridging our communities, understand how deeply rooted our cultures are, learn from each cultures, and adopt the harmony path. I also want to see a curriculum, that excites our kids into thinking and differentiate between right and wrong. And, but what I don't want to see is challenging a belief or, ideology or even highlighting an ideology or promoting supremacy. I also did not see from Elena's slide, and I want to know why. I have lots of questions myself, and I'll save those for Q&A as to why all the ethnicities were not covered, any reason behind it, any rational thinking behind it. The whole thing should be along the lines of progression, but not regression. And again, a naive question I had was when the so-called experts formed this curriculum, what was the composition of the committee? How many parents of schools were there, or did they talk to students, because they are the ones who are going to be the stakeholders of this entire curriculum? And was there any input taken from parents? And were there any surveys? And a lot of questions on my side, but I'll again save it for Q&A. But thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was really enlightening.
So Elena, do you have something to add on her question in terms of whether there was any survey taken from parents or students about?
So I can answer that.
Curriculum.
Yeah, I can answer.
Oh, Will can jump in because you might have some perspective. Yeah. So.
Okay, so in terms of the composition of the advisory committee, it was primarily teachers. There was no input from parents. It was primarily teachers. And again, as I mentioned, the majority of them, I think 65%, were from 60 to 65% were from critical ethnic studies background. And that's because of the nomination process. More than half of the nominations came from one person on the Instructional Quality Commission, who is a leader in the critical ethnic studies movement. So it's a very, the process was very, very unusual for them, for the Instructional Quality Commission. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Everything about this is highly, highly unusual. So we're in uncharted territory here. And in terms of the other question of sorry, let me just back up for a moment. But the idea is this is our chance to make our voices heard. So the way that it works is they put together this draft, the advisory committee, they gave it to the Instructional Quality Commission. The commission voted to make it open to the public. The public replied no and said there are lots of problems here. They tried again with a different group of people, but part of the problem is they recycle some of the same people as the experts. They still haven't gotten it right, but we have a chance to keep working with them. So this is our chance. This is how the parents are being heard. In terms of the composition of who the groups are, so critical ethnic studies traditionally focuses on those 4, what they call foundational groups. And the foundational groups are African American, Asian American, Latinx, and Native American. In addition, later on in the process, just now Pacific Islander population was added. based on advocacy and requests that they got. And so my understanding is that some people in the critical ethnic studies movement say that that is common within their discipline. And in addition to that, the Arab American community had a strong advocacy effort to be included as well. And they're putting them under Asian Americans. Again, my understanding, and I don't want to speak for them, for the critical ethnic studies folks, but my understanding is that in their world, in their discipline, which again isn't the regular ethnic studies world, it's the critical ethnic studies world, it is sometimes true that they've decided to include Arab Americans under the Asian American umbrella. Now you ask a really good question, which is who decides what groups are covered? And that's a great question to ask. And the answer so far has been the critical ethnic studies folks have decided. In addition, you can decouple who is covered from the political ideology. So there's been some confusion that, oh, you could, if you focus on these 4 groups, then you have to go with the political ideology. Well, you don't, actually. They're 2 separate issues. You could still focus on the groups. There can be a debate over whether or not that's a good idea. You can debate whether or not the political ideology is a good idea. And they're 2 completely separate issues. So I hope that helps a little bit. There's a lot of debate over asking the CDE, the California Department of Education, to actually give criteria for how they decided. And to date, they have not done so. There have been lots of organizations that have asked them to do it.
I think this emphasizes a lot more that parents need to be involved even more right now, because, you know, I think they are also one of the biggest stakeholders and their voices need to be heard. And my other question was, is this curriculum customizable, meaning would it be different per district? We can.
So the curriculum is a model curriculum, and Will can talk more to how that actually plays out. The way that it works is they're presented with a model curriculum, and teachers and districts are free to use the parts of it that they like. They're also allowed to certainly add something additional to the curriculum, but the fundamentals of it are displayed in there. So it's that's why I keep coming back to those guiding principles, because that's what tells the teachers, here's what should guide what and how you teach. I don't know, Will, if you have anything to add to that in terms of the actual implementation.
No, I think that's good.
Yeah, okay, so to me, first of all, it's really odd to consider Arab Americans as Asians, because I've been looking at this because of Proposition 16, that race is all self-identified. And according to US Census, Arab Americans and North African are considered white. And now in ethnic studies, somehow they are not white and they are considered people of color now. Now, how is that going to all play out? It's very interesting. And then the second thing, I think, in terms of adoption, I can see parallel in some previous bills that was passed by the legislature, and the intent was pretty positive. But then there were groups that's pushing a pretty progressive radical curriculum. And so I can see for this one, even if the guiding principles got modified, even now the draft is toned down, the same group of people who promoted the 2019 draft will continue to push the same curriculum to individual school districts. So it really doesn't matter what eventually the model curriculum is. That group of people will continue to push the very questionable critical ethnic studies paradigm to a lot of school districts. So all of the parents need to watch out what your school district are adopting, because a lot of times such adoption may not even be at the school board level, and it might just be already in the classroom. We don't even know.
So if I may, Liang, I'm going to both agree and disagree with you, because that is a good thing, as Will points out, and we should absolutely be free to disagree with each other. The thing where I disagree is that the guiding principles don't matter. I think that there are things we can do, and it matters for us to keep pushing for the approach. The part where I agree with you is that it is absolutely not enough, 100%. That I think that we should all try to ensure that the overall model and the approach is the critical thinking, not the critical ethnic studies, but the critical thinking, the critical analysis, the non-radical political approach. And at the same time, it's super important to keep in touch with your school boards to see what's being implemented, because it is absolutely true that there's a lot of leeway, and the same people that are pushing for this curriculum absolutely are going to continue advocating for training the teachers this way and actually teaching them.
Exactly. So that's why I think that's all the more important to correct the guiding principle, so that the very radical curriculum could not comply with the new guiding principle. Then they will not be considered balanced. They will not be considered. Then that way we can really protect more of our children. So it's all the more important to make sure we have good balanced guiding principle. And can you show the next slide? Chin, can we see the next slide? Hello?
Leon, while we do that,
okay.
From Virginia that she would really like addressed. Can I go ahead and answer that?
What?
There's a question from Virginia that she would really like addressed.
Oh, okay, sure.
She's really trying to answer, so I want to make sure I get that attention.
Oh, yeah.
Her question is around, shouldn't ethnic studies be should we be focused on this rather than rewriting history and social studies framework to bring in the experiences from marginalized communities? And I think that there are different answers to that. I don't want to presume to answer as an expert for this field, but I will tell you my understanding of the different angles of this. One approach will say, yes, absolutely, and we should not be teaching ethnic studies as a separate thing if we all agree as a society, and most of us I believe do, that it's important to incorporate ethnic studies and marginalized communities into the teaching of history and social studies, and that is what we should be doing. And it should be properly incorporated in an academic and scholarly way. There's another school of thought that will say, yeah, but we haven't done it. And we've been saying that we should do it on and on. So while we still haven't done it, let's do this as a stopgap measure until we can incorporate it in. So I'm just laying it out without giving my own thoughts on this. I'm just laying out what the thinking is from folks that are saying, let's have a separate ethnic studies course. It's that's nice to incorporate it into the rest, but it just hasn't happened, and we've been trying it. It's still not happening. So in the meantime, let's get this ethnic studies course going. That's my best attempt to kind of represent both opinions on this.
Okay, so this slide I pulled up on some language from history and social science framework, where it says that we should develop respect for cultural diversity and see advantages of inclusion. That should be a part of ethnic studies. And in the chapter 1 of the 2022 draft, I see this kind of language, which makes me very confused. So it says that we would consider people a person of color, but this is a term that's only primarily used in United States. And it's meant to be inclusive among non-white groups and emphasizing common experiences of racism. I think as someone who is from a Chinese descent, I think there are discrimination and racism between every races. And it's not just between white and non-white. Even among Chinese, throughout the history, we have all kinds of discrimination between different subgroups of Chinese. And then I think India also, there are all kinds of subgroups. So this is kind of a human culture that people in power, they will, it's not really, a lot of times not really race. So this confuses me that we are trying to be inclusive, but only inclusive among people that we identify as people of color, which now include Arab Americans now. So how are we going to say, who are we including? This is, what do you think about this kind of conflict?
So I think that there's also another, so this whole thing is kind of like a plate of spaghetti. Every time you pull one strand and you think you got it, it's tied up to another strand and it just keeps going and going. So this is another strand that we haven't talked much about, but the idea is who should be included. So we started talking a little bit about how it was decided, and it was through this critical ethnic studies discipline. But of course, the question is who gets to decide. And on that strand of inclusion, there are many groups that have registered their concern, whether Armenians or Sikhs or lots of non-Arab Middle Easterners, so Middle Eastern, North African people that are non-Arab. So there are lots of different groups that have expressed concern that they're not included. One of the approaches to take is, because it is unrealistic to include every single group, because then all we would be doing is teaching ethnic studies to the exclusion of everything else. One of the approaches that some organizations and individuals have taken is to ask the Department of Education to say, look, just tell us what criteria you're using. Is it by percentage? Is it by population in California? Is it by something else? But to come up with something that actually says, this is what the criteria are. One of the issues has been that the process has been quite non-transparent and it's difficult to tell. Beyond that, I think we would be getting into philosophical category that I think could take us hours and hours to discuss here. So I don't know that we'll get to philosophically the differences between what type of discrimination there is, but I think your point is well taken that it's important to address across the board all kinds of discrimination and bigotry, and to enable teachers to teach what is appropriate in their classrooms and in their own communities.
Yeah, I think this question was asked of one of the curriculum designer who is a UC Davis professor, and I encourage everyone to watch the KQED interview of that professor and Professor Thomas D, because there were questions like this asked, and the answer from the UC Davis professor was, well, because traditionally the ethnic studies only consider 4 ethnicities, so only these 4 can be considered. There is no other answer. But the host, Michael Krasny, he kept pushing. But then we have evolved so much. We are so diverse now. Why are we considering only these 4? And there are some other questions that he asked. For example, he addressed the capitalism. As in the curriculum, capitalism is somehow equate with as causing all the inequality that we see in the world, and then that somehow equates racism. And the answer from that professor was, capitalism has created a huge inequality. What is wrong with fighting inequality? What is wrong with fighting racism? So it's like, so that's my most concern about this curriculum, is it's very anti-capitalism, which I think capitalism, is a foundation of the democracy we have here in America that sets us apart. And now if we are attacking that, what is the goal of this kind of curriculum? I don't know. Am I overreacting to this? I mean, there are pros and cons. Of course, there are disadvantage and advantage of capitalism or other kind of structure, but they should both be discussed. And that professor, when asked, she didn't even think there is anything positive about capitalism to discuss in the curriculum.
So Leon, I can take that one, and then I see in the chat box that there are a couple of questions, and it looks like Will is willing to answer one of the questions about one of the questions from Piper that was posed around critical race theory. And so let me answer your question, and then Will, maybe you can take the next one from Piper. I think what you're raising and what came out in that KQED interview was is really a valid point here, and that is, what role do economic systems such as capitalism versus communism play in all this? Certainly, if you look back at the intent of what the legislature meant when they passed the bill, we don't see anything about economic systems. We don't see anything about political systems. We see building understanding and bridges. And yes, talking about challenges, but not from the perspective of discussing discussing that we should be working toward a quote unquote truer democracy in the form of capitalism. In the form of communism. So if it were up to me, then if the teachers feel that it is important to teach capitalism as part of the discussion of ethnic studies, I think it actually makes sense to talk about the pros and the cons, to talk about, all the immigrants that have found success in the US and the contributions and what capitalism has brought to them, and to talk about communism and the idea and what it has led to in many, many countries and how it has played out and why people have fled communist countries to come to a capitalist system. None of this, when we talk about not bringing politics, and I think somebody commented this on the chat, that education could be political. To some extent, that's true. On the other hand, we're not talking about whether or not we talk about the politics. We're not talking about whether or not we talk about the economic theories. We're talking about whether or not we promote a particular theory and position it as the right thing. So does it make sense to place capitalism together with racism? To my mind, no. That's a pretty clear answer in my mind. Does it make sense to talk about the fallout from capitalist systems and what are some of the things that happen in the context of what's good, what's bad? Absolutely. Does that belong in ethnic studies? Maybe, I don't know. But what is clear is that this type of political curriculum that specifically equates anti-capitalism with anti-racism is not what the legislators intended, nor is it what most Californians would want. I'd like to turn it over to Will for a bit too, because I think there are a couple of questions.
Chin, can you go to next slide? And then Elena, you can maybe pick the next question to answer while we go to the next slide.
John, did you want to have, there are lots of questions that are coming up here that I think Will was going to answer at least one of them from Piper, so maybe we answer that one.
Yeah, you can answer that first.
Sure. Which question was that? I'm happy to answer anything. Or I mean, not that I have answers, but I'm happy to give my thoughts on whatever.
I see Piper was asking a question about critical race theory, critical ethnic studies theory, and
having a representative.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I think is really important. When you dive into the work, I believe it's Allison Bailey, a critical race theory professor. Part of the, I don't know about, the organization of this particular panel discussion, but it's actually quite difficult to get critical race theory professors and experts to engage in a panel like this. And I've tried many times. I have a lot of records of emails of me being overly respectful and polite. And I mean, I'm going to publish them in a blog or something. And it's essentially written as using the oppressor's tools is, respectful debate and things like that. So it's very difficult. I think it can be done. Ta-Nehisi Coates had not that he is a critical race theory professor, but subscribes to some of these ideas. And he had a great conversation with John McWhorter, the linguist professor at Columbia. And it was an interesting conversation. And in that, Ta-Nehisi Coates actually admitted that he was wrong and he apologized for the things that he said. But it's quite rare. You will actually never see Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo or Kimberly Crenshaw or Rachel Cargill have an open public discussion with someone who disagrees with them. I mean, it's actually written that in the ideology not to do that. And again, I would want nothing more to be proven wrong and say, what are you talking about, Rouge? Check this out. Here's Rachel Cargill having a full-on conversation with Sam Harris about this issue. I would love to see it, because I think that I agree with you. I think that it's important for them to be represented. But part of this is the unwillingness to have the conversations. And that's part of the problem. It's the unwillingness to budge.
Okay.
And the other thing I just wanted to add to the question about incorporating, I'm sorry, I'm looking for papers.
Just a minute. So everyone, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, because it's much harder for us to look through all the chat. We'll miss the question. So please put the question in the Q&A box, then we can easily tell which one is answer, which one is just a comment. And
I'm trying
maybe let's go to the next slide. We'll go to the next question first. Okay, so maybe if you find, we can answer that later. So
yeah, I just got it. Leon,
oh, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, let me just also from paper around the idea that we don't address with the regular cultural studies, or what are often called multicultural studies, when we talk about the American mosaic, the food and festivals approach, as Piper says, that doesn't recognize or address challenges and inequities of opportunity. So that's a really good question, because for a while the thinking was that, oh, so you can address racism and struggles, or you can just talk about holidays and celebrations and food. And those are the two options. Well, as we found out when we did some research in California with different districts, such as the LA district, that's not true at all. And it turns out that if you look, so you can actually go to the LAUSD Ethnic Studies curriculum, and what you'll see is not something that simply talks about food and celebrations. You'll see something that absolutely addresses challenges and struggles and does talk about oppression, but it doesn't do so in a way that promotes a particular ideology and says that this is what we believe. It is true that it's very difficult to teach history and social studies without a perspective, but there's a very big difference. There's a difference between, and as a professor from SFSU explained to me once, there's a difference between going in, writing a thesis. So in university courses, and hopefully in high school courses as well, we teach that it's not the thesis that matters, it's how you support the thesis. That there is really no such thing as a wrong thesis. It's how you support it and the arguments you present. In critical ethnic studies, there is a right thesis. There's no concept of you can choose a thesis and that's how you support it. So the difference is not about whether or not you bring in politics. The difference is whether or not you promote a particular perspective. And the choices are absolutely not between teaching about racism or learning about foods. The choices are between teaching an ideological, promoting and advocating for an ideological one-sided perspective versus teaching multiple perspectives while at the same time addressing racism and oppression. And I would argue that not only is it not necessary to teach racism while at the same time promoting a particular point of view, but I think it's our obligation now of all times to talk about oppression, racism, challenges, all of that, without being divisive and without exacerbating the divisiveness and the polarization among us. So I think that dichotomy is basically a red herring, and I urge all of you to not get caught up in this idea that, oh, I can only do one or the other. I can only talk about parties or I can talk about racism.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to move on to the implementation. So even if we were successful in adopting balanced guiding principle, how the course is taught is still important. There is a National Education Association report that says there is considerable research evidence that ethnic studies curricula have positive academic outcome for students, but only if it's well designed and well taught. And if you hear the KQED forum interview of Dr. Thomas D., He is the professor, Stanford professor who studied the pilot in San Francisco Unified School District. And he emphasized it's a very small pilot, and they have the teachers had support of a lot of scholars to provide them. So he has sincere concerns for a rapid scale up of ethnic studies without sufficient teacher support. And in the interview, he said this implementation needs an iterative process to figure out how to best teach it. And he mentioned ethnic studies is a uniquely difficult course to teach. And then my concern is also, if you have a curriculum that's one-sided, would the students who are already feeling uncomfortable expressing certain views, even now today in classroom, under this curriculum, how would we implement it in a way that students feel safe to express their different views from the teacher? Or so maybe Will can tell us how you see, even if we adopted the model curriculum, what kind of teacher training we need, what kind of teacher support we need to have this beautiful ethnic study that we are all looking forward to.
If we're going to do this right, then we need intellectual humility. I think we need a willingness to admit that we've lost track, like the way that Alina so beautifully said it, is that where did we go wrong? There has to be a willingness to go, okay, we've lost our way somehow, and that takes some humility, and it's hard for any of us to admit that we're wrong. But if we're educators and we're trying to promote students to be lifelong educators, no wonder so many students are terrified of failure, because we are, and they see that. And I think that they see teachers who are, excuse me, it's not COVID, I swear. They see teachers as unwilling to budge, then they hold their ground. So I think that we need teachers who are willing to do this hard work, seek this confirmation. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing. And I think that the answer, I think really is the stuff that I'm doing, which is like, let's have these conversations. Let's join organizations like Heterodox Academy, and let's, be willing to talk. And I think a part of that is having grace with one another, and not, trying to go into this like you're wrong, and going into this, all of us, even myself, leading the way of like, I could be wrong about a lot of things. And there's something really wonderful about everyone going in with the core intentions of let's do this right. But it's going to be quite a challenge, because it's been given a paved road. There's been no pushback really allowed, and I've talked to a lot of teachers that are quite scared to give any kind of pushback whatsoever. And fear is a very powerful thing, as we all know. So we have to quell that fear and make sure that doesn't grow, so we can allow people to give some pushback of this doesn't sit right, this doesn't feel right.
So Sudha, from a parent's point of view, what you think you would hope to see in terms of teacher training? Is she there? Okay, so I guess
I have one thing. I'm sorry, which is one thing to add also. If we want to bring in, I had this on a slide. It didn't make it to the show, but if we want to bring in, I have no problem with reading White Fragility. I've read it almost like the whole thing through twice almost. Or How to Be an Anti-Racist or something. That's fine. What I think would be a really cool exercise is you read that, and then you read Douglas Murray's book, Madness of Crowds, or you read Helen Pluckrose's book, Cynical Theories. And what you do is you read them both. We're not in the business of burning books, so to speak. We're not trying to censor. It's the exact opposite. Because when you have a bad idea, that's why cancel culture is so dangerous of a concept. What you do is when you have a bad idea, you beat it with a better idea. So we get into the kind of like war of ideas, and we can take this book, read it, interesting. We take this book, read it, interesting, and then we can have a real dialogue as a faculty about what you liked and what you didn't. I think that could be something that a way to roll this out is we just add more viewpoint diversity within the curriculum. Yeah, sorry.
Great. So sounds like not only parents should be involved with to make sure that the curriculum is well designed, and maybe we should start pushing for better teacher training right now to be more tolerant of diverse point of view, get everyone to join Heterox Academy, right? And so we start that training now from now on.
Now, I saw people
next.
raise hands. Do you want to allow them to talk?
I think we probably don't have time. Please, everyone, type your question in the Q&A box. So it's already 6:40. So next slide, please. Do we want to? Let's see if you have time. Okay. So now, after everything we've heard, I looked at the bill of AB 2016. The curriculum is supposed to prepare students to be global citizens, not only use as citizens, global citizens with an appreciation for contributions of multiple cultures. Which is why I'm a little concerned of why are we using people of color term, which is a term that, if it's a term that's only used in US, how are we preparing students to be global citizens, which we really need right now with the world is merging into one big world. We need to understand other culture, not just US culture, right? We don't like it when the history is all Eurocentric, but the ethnic studies probably shouldn't be US-centric. It should be inclusive of all cultures in the world. Since people, the United States, we attract people from all over the world. So it's your decision whether the model curriculum guiding principle that's in the draft, emphasizing critical empire, and criticizing white supremacy, capitalism, and emphasizing power and oppression, and using terms of resistance movement. Are these something you would like to see in the guiding principle? If not, maybe you should write. But if it is something you like, you can also write that to them too. So next slide, please. So you decide what you would like to do. And before September 30th, email your comment to this address, or you can send it through the Alliance of Constructive Ethnic Studies, which is the group that's co-founded by Elena Kaplan. They have a group of volunteers who have done detailed studies, and they are sending their detailed comments. So sending through their website will make their voices stronger, so that with the ethnic studies will not be hijacked by a narrow political agenda. And please share with your friends and inform your local school board members, because they also need to know this is coming. This is definitely coming, because the bill likely will be signed by the governor, and it will become a graduation requirement. I think high schools are required to offer it starting from 2025, and then that means they will start to adopt curriculums in the next 2 years. But at the same time, even in Santa Clara County, they have formed the ethnic studies task force to try and push components of ethnic studies to starting from kindergarten. So it's important for all of us to find out what's being taught to our children and learn more about these terms. What's regular ethnic studies? What's critical ethnic studies? What's critical race theory? That theory is if you have college students, this is all already implemented in colleges, and they are already being taught. So next, I think that's So Elena, do you have anything to say about actions people can take?
Yeah, I think that you just summarized it, Leon. I think that the things people can do are email, and I just put into the chat box so it's easier to copy and paste. Form that you can customize. You can just click on that and you can enter your information, and then it'll fill in the actual letter for you that you can personalize, or you can send as is. If you have questions, you can email us at this calstudies@gmail.com address, and keep an eye out for what's happening on your own school boards, and make your voices heard for what's happening within your own communities. You can also share it with your legislators, because it very much matters what you get across to them.
That's true. I think our legislators, they adopted the bill, AB 2016. They had no idea the content of the model curriculum is so far away from the legislative intent. So even the legislators need to know, and they should voice out whether this is their intent to do this. And next slide is our contact information. So I think right now, you are welcome to take a picture and then contact us. Oh, I still forget to remove the dots. So right now we are at 6:45. Do we want to open up for audience to speak, or do we want to just wrap up and maybe answer some final questions?
I actually need to go,
Oh,
but this was wonderful. Thank you guys for giving me a platform. I hope that I keep in touch with all of you, and to everyone who's watching this, whether it's live or in the future, please reach out. Instagram I use a lot, but you can also email me at the connections here, and I think this is really important. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Great. So thank you for joining us. Yeah. Bye.
Thank
So,
you, Diane. I also have to jump for another meeting, which is
sorry.
Started at 6:30. But thank you for the opportunity.
Okay.
Liang, there's a question.
Yeah, do you have some questions? Now I can stay a bit so we can open up for more free-form discussion if Lina is up to it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, okay, good, because she probably knows the best. So we have.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we get every question. So if anyone has not had their question answered, if you could go ahead and
raise your hand if you want to talk now. We are.
Okay. Now we have one person raise hands now. Do you want to?
Okay. Yeah. So that's here.
Okay. Siwa.
Yeah. My question was, would there be slides or recording available? I came in late.
Oh, yeah. There will be. The whole webinar is recorded.
So it will be available where? In the.
I think in Huva, where we can.
The event.
Yeah.
Or just email me, lfchal@gmail.com. I think some people probably didn't sign in through Huva.
Yeah.
Or
can you
email,
hear me? You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So can you hear me? I think they are going to load it on Dingding TV and also on CRUSA website, so people can actually get that. And usually it will take like 1 or 2 days. You know, the volunteers is going to edit, and then they will upload onto the website. And then, you know, we can send it to all the participants, whoever registered. Yeah.
So it sounds like there will be an email that goes out to people.
Yes.
Let them know it's available. Okay. So we've got.
Yeah.
Great. We have a couple of content questions that I'm seeing. One says, I'm wondering if the committee included representatives from all regions of the state. The answer is, I don't think that they were looking for representatives for every geographical region, so I don't believe so. However, they were looking for some sort of representation from both Northern California and Southern California. I have not actually looked at how equal it is or how well distributed they were. Then there's another question on, is there a planned schedule to implement the ethnic studies curriculum in K-12 schools, or is it still under development and open to consider other options? So the ESMC that we've been talking about, the intent is to bring it into K-12. There is no requirement as of yet to bring it in. The requirement refers to only high school, and at the same time, many school boards are voting to bring it into their K-8 schools as well. So it really is up to the districts at this point. But when they bring in ethnic studies, the idea is that it would be based on the model curriculum, which is why it's all the more important that everybody pays attention, because this impacts really everyone across the state, regardless of what age children, or even if they have children at all. I also see question about, also wonder if the committee included all ethnic groups of people accordingly. You know, the committee had 18 people, the advisory committee, so there's only so much they could do in terms of including ethnic groups. Again, I haven't studied the ethnic makeup. I believe that they were trying to get some kind of cross-section. I think that the issue is the issue of what kind of representation they were looking for. It's not that they have low representation of different ethnic groups or different geographical area. What they didn't get representation of, or equally distributed representation of, is thoughts and ideas. And what happened is, because most people were coming in from this activist advocacy bend, that's how it came out that more than half of the members, regardless of whether they were like Latinx or Black, I think there may have been a couple of Asian Americans on there, but Asian Americans as well, regardless of what their ethnic background was, almost, well, I won't say all of them, but most of them were coming from that critical ethnic studies background, regardless of geography or ethnic group. And then there was another question about, somebody made a comment about how could we decide who, two things. One was a comment about how can we decide what gets taught, and that yes, it would be good to let students decide, but who gets to decide what is taught in the school? And I think that's a great question, and really this is part of what this discussion is all about, right? Who gets to decide? And the idea is that it should be educators that decide from the perspective of following the social studies framework, from following all good educational practices, and with parent input, that we put that forth, we put that out there as a model curriculum, and then teachers decide what they teach and based off of that model curriculum. Other than that, I'm not sure if we could hope for more than that to figure out. Clearly, this is not going to be a referendum where every single person gets to weigh in on what topics gets included in ethnic studies. There was another one last question that I saw was around how do we figure out who gets included, and it's true that it's hard to figure out what the criteria are, but I think the argument that many people are making is that there should be some criteria that are shared, regardless of what they are. And so whether it's by percentages, somebody was saying, well, how can you do it by percentages since it's minorities? That's true, but we know, for example, that a very high percentage of the population in California is Latinx. So it makes sense to include Latinx. We also have a Coptic Christian population that could be less than 1%. So we could include those, but the issue is that we need to have some sort of criteria.
Yeah, so I posted a link of an article from edsource.org. It has information about the latest bill that's adopted this year regarding the high school graduation requirement. Fortunately, they had accepted an amendment to allow local school district or charter school governing board to adopt a locally developed ethnic studies course. So that means your local school board should be able to design or select which ethnicities to cover that reflect your student body. So then it's important for the parents to be involved with local school boards on what's actually being taught. And in terms of timeline, I think the model curriculum would be the timeline is to adopt that by March of next year, 2021. And then I think Elena has in her slide that there will be another 45-day open review period after they have the third draft. But then this is model curriculum, so school districts are not required to follow over the curriculum. And then in terms of timeline, the one amendment that they accepted was to push back the start date of the graduation requirement to 2029. So for the graduating class of 2029, 2030, it's those who are graduating in 2030, that will be the first year where ethnic study will be a graduation requirement. However, all school districts are required to offer the class in the year 2025. So usually adoption takes 2 years. So that means 2023, they probably will start the adoption process. But then that being said, I asked Professor Thomas D, because he was concerned about the pace that we are pushing out to all school districts. I said, this is pushed back. Do you think that's enough time for us to scale up? And since now it's pushed back, he still thinks that's too rush. He still thinks that it will be, teachers will need a lot of support. They will need a lot of teacher training to implement this right. Because if it implemented properly, this will be positive for students. But if not, some students this might negatively affect students, especially students now might be labeled negatively because of their ethnicity, right? I'm concerned about that. So it's important for teachers to teach it a well-designed way that it's really inclusive, and so people feel they are all, they can discuss these difficult topics safely. But then that said, I think Santa Clara County, all the counties are probably already looking into inserting components of ethnic studies into social study or English, starting from kindergarten. So even if the requirement is not to have a formal course by 2025, you should expect to see this is all small components or here and there will be in the classroom. So it's important to ask the school district, what are you doing? And are you doing this? What's the timeline, and how decisions will be made on how it's taught?
Yeah, so I just want to add to that there are definitely districts that are already not only teaching but requiring it. This is up to the different districts. I happen to be in one of them, for example. My niece is currently in 9th grade, and the class that normally would have been taught, the history class that is world history per semester in 9th grade, is replaced with ethnic studies, and that's across that school board, across that school district. So there are many districts that are already adopting ethnic studies as a requirement for graduation, even before it's mandatory across the state. There's a question from Howard Wang, which is the following: in addition to considering curriculum around ethnic studies, how would a school district establish policies that complement the curriculum and deal with hate and violence against fellow students from different ethnic backgrounds? That's a great question. I think so. Part of the intent was that this ethnic studies model curriculum is supposed to be encouraging that, thus the high degree of concern around the divisiveness that comes along with it, because the idea was partially that it would come out of this curriculum and that there would be ways to build understanding and empathy so that the hate and violence is reduced rather than increasing polarization and divisiveness. In terms of what can school districts do, I think they have a fair amount of flexibility to do things in addition to the ESMC, and I won't presume to speak on the behalf of the administrators of those districts, but there's certainly quite a bit of flexibility for them to do what they can do on top of it. The idea is just that the ESMC portion has to do with what they do with ethnic studies needs to be based on the ESMC. And beyond that, they can absolutely offer other things. There was also a comment that the same person made, that Howard Wang made, about I had talked about communism as an economic theory, and yes, of course, it is not only economic theory, but also a political ideology, and that, of course, goes hand in hand.
There is a question I think was not answered. It's from Virginia. He's asking, is ethnic studies the right place to direct our attention and energy? Would it be more prudent to focus on rewriting history of social studies of K-12, in that framework, and then focus on stories and experience and history from marginalized communities?
So this is the one that we were talking before about, how the thinking is that, yes, ideally it would be incorporated into the history and social studies framework, but the thinking is from some people is that since it hasn't happened yet, the thinking in some circles is that ethnic studies is a stopgap measure. And then in other circles, there are those that think that no, that's the right way. So there are different groups of thought to it. On whether or not there should be ethnic studies at all, whether or not it should be incorporated, or whether or not it should be incorporated eventually, but for now we have ethnic studies. The bottom line is that the bill has passed. So we can certainly spend time debating whether or not it should have passed, but the bill mandating the creation of this curriculum has passed. And our time, I would posit, would be better spent figuring out how to make this an effective curriculum, rather than talking backwards about whether or not it should have been passed in the first place.
Yeah, make a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay.
And there was a Howard one. He said his question was not answered.
No, that's the one that I just answered.
Oh, okay. Any more questions? Okay, great. So thank you everyone for a great session. I think this is very enlightening. We all learned a lot, and we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. And I think it's just wonderful for our children to learn about not only their own ethnicity, but then all the diverse ethnicities that we have in United States and in California. There is rich culture in every and then if this could be something really beautiful if we all help to make sure it's implemented properly and it's taught properly, and then help with teacher training. Yeah, so that's hopefully will come. Maybe next year we will see have a clearer path to a very good ethnic studies course for our kids. Yeah, thank you
for facilitating.
Yeah.
Thank you.